The Toronto Comic Arts Festival would like to honor and acknowledge the original caretakers of this land, the Anishinaabe, Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation, Haudenosaunee, and the Huron-Wendat peoples. We are in a territory that was the subject of the Dish with One Spoon One Pump Belt Covenant, an agreement between the Anishinaabe, Mississaugas, Haudenosaunee, and allied nations to share and care for the land. This land is also covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit. This acknowledgement is a reminder that we are all treaty people and that we have a responsibility to the land and each other. TCAF celebrates the long history of sharing stories on this land and is committed to increasing Indigenous voices and perspectives in our programming.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to TCAF 2024. My name is Faduma Gure from the programming team. TCAF weekend is on May 11th and 12th. Welcome. Look out for our digital marketplace dates as well. On behalf of TCAF, we're honored to have with us today award-winning cartoonist and chief creative officer at Charles M. Schulz Creative Associates, Paige Braddock. And we're excited to have the brilliant cartoonist, artist, and professor of studio art at School of Fine Art and Music at University of Guelph, Christian Giroux. Thanks so much for being here with us at TCAF this year. And Paige Braddock, Christian Giroux, please take it away.
It's an incredible pleasure to be part of the TCAF programming in 2024. And I can think of a few things that are more delightful than spending an hour with one of my favorite cartoonists, Paige Braddock. Just by way of introduction, I want to say that Paige is an award-winning cartoonist, writer, and chief creative officer at Charles M. Schultz Creative Associates. Her Eisner-nominated comic strip, Jane's World, is the first gay-themed comic to receive online distribution by a national media syndicate in the US. And although it concluded in 2018, after 20 years, it continues to run online on Go Comics. Her current series of graphic novels for young readers is entitled Peanut Butter and Crackers. It's with Penguin Kids and Nosy Crow, based in the UK, and which won a Beverly Cleary Children's Choice Award in 2023. For over 35 years, Paige has worked as an illustrator and graphic designer, and for the past 10 years as a producer in animation. In 1999, she began working in Charles Schultz's studio, where she has illustrated several Peanuts children's books, spearheaded the art direction of licensed products, and that includes video games and apparel. And now, as the chief creative officer, she oversees the collaborations with entities such as NASA and Apple TV, and is shepherding the Peanuts gang as it continues to develop in our contemporary media landscape. In 2023, she received an Emmy for her work on the Apple documentary, Who Are You, Charlie Brown, which won for Outstanding Nonfiction Program. She also won a Canadian Screen Award for Best Animated Program. She received an honorary doctorate in fine arts from the Montserrat College of Art in Beverly, Massachusetts. So again, Paige, thank you so much for joining me today. It's such a pleasure. We have so much to talk about, but as usual, we should dial it back and start from the beginning. So you were born in the Deep South, correct?
Actually, this is crazy, but I was born in California, but my parents were both from Georgia. So the minute that they could move back to the South, I think I was 5, we came back to the Deep South. Yeah, and I spent most of my childhood in southern Mississippi in a pretty rural area. Yeah, thus the accent. You don't get this accent in California. You have to be in the South to get this accent.
Oh, and we're coming back. We're coming back to the accent. So okay, so let's say it's sometime somewhere in the 70s. You're 7, 8, or 9, somewhere in there. What does a typical weekend look like for little Paige in rural Mississippi?
Well, I used to joke and say I think I became a cartoonist because I was like a little bit lonesome and bored, but not in a sad way, because when you're a cartoonist, you can sort of create your own circle of friends, right? My dad was a forester, so we always lived kind of out a little bit, not always in neighborhoods. So there was a lot of having to entertain yourself as a kid. a lot of times in the woods, a lot of times riding bikes, a lot of time drawing. So it's funny. My dad was a big fan of Westerns, so a lot of my early comics had cowboys in them. I don't know. It's just like that parental influence.
And who were your comics influences? What were you reading at that time?
Being in the middle of nowhere, kind of, we didn't really have comic shops. So really it was just a Sunday paper that had Sunday comics in it. That's what we mostly looked at. And I remember the first characters I was trying to emulate, how you learn by doing, right? So you're trying to trace or imitate the guys that you think are the best. Anyway, was Popeye and Snoopy, and a little bit of Beetle Bailey thrown in back when this was in the 70s. So back when Mort Walker was still doing Beetle Bailey himself. So
Nice. Well, and
all those characters had very different character design too, if you think about it. Like
yeah,
Snoopy was like, Peanuts was kind of minimalist. Beetle Bailey was more about gags. It was very gag driven. And then Popeye, all the character design in Popeye is just so good. Yeah.
So those those were the first things you were exposed to that fed your imagination. You started making comics at a very young age, but by the time you got to high school, you found an extraordinary mentor. Can you tell us a little bit about that experience?
Yeah, I was one of those. I always wanted to be a cartoonist from like age 7. And so anytime I could find a way to publish my work, I would publish it, whether that was like the middle school newsletter that, or not, like whatever it was. And so when I was in high school, I was doing comics for my high school newspaper, but also our county had a small newspaper, a small weekly newspaper. And there was a guy named Dave Growy who was a cartoonist. He had taken over, he was doing Alley Oop. He had taken it over from V.T. Hamlin. Alley Oop's a really great comic about, a time traveling caveman. So, I mean, that right there is funny, right? That's like comedy gold. So anyway, Dave saw my comic strip in the paper and got my number from the newspaper and called me and offered to give me some tips, which was huge, right? Meanwhile, my mom's in the background going, wait a minute, this guy who has a cabin in the woods invited you to come like see his studio? No, that's not happening. Anyway, it was just like a funny kind of like moment in time. But my dad ended up going up to Dave's studio with me, and Dave, he was amazing. He gave me my first bottle of ink, my first T-square, my first triangle, my first bit of Bristol board. He really was the guy who showed me this is how professional cartoonists work. I was just kind of winging it, using felt tip markers or whatever paper I had around. I had not until then been exposed to like the tools of the trade. Anyway, Dave was great.
And so he would actually like sit down with you, draw with you, kind of show you how to lay out a strip. I mean, do you remember any of those kind of core lessons that he did with you?
Yeah, he did. He would show me, he had a very he had a very complicated, not complicated, but it had a lot of steps to it, his process, because he would draw his whole comic out and line it out on tracing paper. And then he would put that on a light box, and then he would ink on top of it so that there was no pencil lines on the actual final board. That was way too much. I like to draw with ink. I don't like to figure everything out at the pencil stage, because I feel like then the inks look like they lose some of the life that they retain if you're doing more drawing with the ink. So at the time, I don't think I could have articulated that, but I preferred a more immediate method of just like light penciling and then inking directly on the paper. But it was funny. He at the time I was doing this cowboy comic, because that's what I did, and he was like, "Why are you drawing a cowboy? Why aren't you doing why aren't you drawing a female lead character?" And I was like, well, because I mean, this is the 70s, and I'm looking at the comics page, and all the lead characters are male, right? So I'm saying to him, well, I think a character that's a male can do more. And I was like, years later, sort of struck by my own internalized sexism about that decision. Um, because if you look at those classic strips, the women were sort of, the female characters were sort of the straight men to, you know, they were never the generator of the gag. They were always responding to the gag. So it was like a very formulaic kind of comic strip storytelling device. And I was trying to emulate that, not even really reflecting on myself and thinking, oh yeah, why am I not doing a female lead character?
And when did you make that switch then? I guess when did you catch yourself and kind of that internalized sexism and start to kind of change the role of your female lead character?
Yeah, I mean, him saying that sometimes, a mentor will say something to you, and in the moment you don't know what you think about it. And then that comment really stayed with me. And so by the time I got to college, it sort of just fermented in the back of my brain. So by the time I got to college, I did launch a new comic strip in my college newspaper at the University of Tennessee, and it was called Sadie. So it was like basically two female leads and then one best friend who was a guy, which oddly ended up being a very similar format to what Jane's World became later. So somehow Sadie was the precursor to Jane's World.
But okay, well, that's perfect too. I wanted to ask you about your art school experience a little bit. So you came from a very small town in Mississippi, like you said, very rural. You're out once a lot. As I understand it, came from a very maybe more traditional family, more with a religious upbringing, and then you find yourself in Knoxville. Is that right? Knoxville, Tennessee.
Yep.
You're now in a city. There's a nightlife. You're surrounded by other art students. In my mind, it just seems like you're leaping between worlds. But maybe that's too much. What was your art school experience like?
Well, we did move to North Carolina, so I had a little bit of a transitional high school experience where we were in a slightly bigger town outside of Asheville, North Carolina. But then Knoxville was like, I don't even know how to articulate how sort of life-changing my college experience was. Until I got to college, I'd never had a formal like art class. There was so much I did not know. I was really self-taught, or I had learned from people like Dave who were trying to, sort of nurture the cartooning side. There was a lot of just like classical art training I had never been exposed to, different mediums you can use, all kind of stuff. So Knoxville was just like, somebody going in a dark room and turning on a light switch, right? It was not only was I learning all this stuff about art, and I was now doing a comic with a female lead, I was starting to get the clue that maybe I was gay, but I wasn't really sure because, like you said, I came out of this very traditional Southern Baptist upbringing, never was exposed to anything, although all the time feeling different, right? But not having the language to even articulate what that was. And then you get to art school and you're surrounded by all these artists and you meet other people who are very similar to you, and like, why are we all like this, and why do we hit it off so quickly, and why do we like all the same things? And anyway, yeah, it was a big 4 years of self-discovery as a person and as an artist. And yeah, I can't say enough good things about my university experience at Knoxville.
And during that time, your comics, your protagonists were evolving, they were changing. And it seems like based on your CV, you went directly essentially from art school into the really big newspaper rooms. You were immediately working in like the legendary Chicago Tribune and the Atlanta Constitution as an illustrator, a graphic designer. And while developing Jane's World, or what would become Jane's World. So I guess I want to just, using the same question again, what would a weekend in the 90s where young Paige Braddock newspaper woman is, forging this unique path while working in a really traditional, conventional newsroom in the 1980s.
Yeah, I used to like stay up really late because I work nights. If you're like an entry level newspaper person, you work nights and weekends and holidays. So and all your friends have day jobs, and so you get off at night and there's nobody to hang out with. Usually, I would just stay up late, eat really sugary cereal, and draw comics. That was the beginning of Jane's World. That's why when you read the really early stuff, it probably makes no sense because it was just total like stream of consciousness, like, oh, this would be funny. Oh, this would be funny. Never thinking about what's the connective tissue of these stories that you're sort of stringing together. But it was sort of a great way to develop a comic because I wasn't overthinking like what am I trying to say? Like I wasn't trying to figure everything out all at once. I was just letting these characters evolve sort of organically, and just kind of seeing what stuck, which in a weird way is a little bit what Schultz did. If you look at his early strips, he had characters that he ended up abandoning, right? That he wrote in early on in the 50s and then left behind. And so I think a lot of cartoonists do, there's probably two kinds of cartoonists. The cartoonist who, writes a clear outline and has a clear concept of a book and like does a long form story. And then there's another cartoonist that's maybe more like me, who's kind of by the seat of their pants, who's just sort of intuitively, growing with the comic that they're writing.
Well, that's interesting. It does seem to me there are kind of a couple different camps: the newspaper comic people, and then the floppy,
Yes. Yeah.
graphic novel
I would
comics.
say that's true. Yeah.
In a way, in terms of how you think about it, how you approach the DNA of it, and so I mean
Yeah,
that.
because a newspaper comic has to be a one thought. Each strip is one thought. And if you are doing it in continuity, then each thought has to feed into the next thought. Like you know what I mean? So it is a little bit of a puzzle. It's a little bit of a brain teaser. Instead of doing a long form story where you're gonna have beginning to end, in 92 pages or 152 pages or whatever.
Right, right.
Yeah.
It's such an interesting kind of time, the 80s and 90s, and also time in your career in terms of when you're working in these, massive newsrooms and so on. You're developing the character, and I'm just thinking there's so many different kinds of both creative but editorial challenges that you're facing at this time because you're a young artist, you're figuring out what you want to do, just jacked up on sugary cereal at 2 a.m. or whatever. And then you also have a strip that is problematic for mainstream distribution, and you're having difficulty finding traction for it because it's as an openly queer character. So I'd love for you to walk us a little bit through just the kind of the tenor of those times, what it was like as a creative trying to put this work out into the world.
Yeah, at that time there were a fair amount of weekly papers still in existence. So you could sell comics to some of the alternative weekly papers, which I did, as other artists also did. But then you're only in one paper, every other week or however frequent those alternatives come out, maybe once a week, maybe, twice a month, once a month. It's really hard to gain traction, right, with an audience if people are only seeing your work that, in that sort of cadence. So I had a friend who was sort of a nerd that worked at the newspaper, and he was like, let's build a website. And I was like, really? Okay. And then you could like post your comic there. This was like 1995. So this is before webcomics were webcomics, right? So, I'd go home at night, do the comic, upload it. I was doing it like 3 days a week or something. And that is really what started, I think, that started Jane on her path, because you could find readers that way. People could comment or write you back. Like you could sort of slowly build an audience online. So that is when in like in the early 90s, well, sorry, in the early would have been at the end of the 90s, I guess, like 99. I was really starting to ramp that up and posting more, more comics per week. And that's when it sort of like really started to gel. But I don't think until I moved to California and took this job I don't think it was until then that everything really came together, because looking back, I tell people for the whole first part of my career, I was either in art classes in a college where they said you can't make money as a cartoonist, and where cartooning was sort of seen as this like not real art, in quotes or whatever. That is certainly not the case anymore. But back in the 70s and 80s, I think that was definitely it was sort of looked down on a little bit, and as an art form. And even Schultz would say that. He would make comments about how his work was viewed as not fine art, even though I would say it is. You could argue that it is fine art. Anyways, so you come out of that sort of environment to a place, the studio in California where Schultz worked, where you're working for the first time in your career in a place where comics are the most important thing there is, right? And so just being in that environment and being around Schultz, you start to say, yeah, the comics are really important. Like Jane's World, it does matter. Like you start to like feel empowered. You feel like your voice is amplified a little bit. I don't know. It was definitely a game changer for me, just in changing the way I thought about myself, my own work, about comics in general.
And I have so many questions about Schultz and your relationship working in the studio. But before we get there, this idea of the empowerment and these early days of internet. I mean, we're at the beginning, and I'm just wondering. I mean, it sounded just like a fly-by-night, like let's put up a website.
It was.
But did it also kind of feel subversive? That you can get around traditional media, and were you able to connect with other queer creators through your
all of
website?
that. Yeah, all of that. It was actually great. It was the best thing I ever did, starting a webcomic. Yeah, because you're alone in your living room, drawing comics, and then yeah, the internet and having a webcomic sort of opened up this community, and you started to connect with other people. It was great, actually.
When I look back on some of the strips in Jane's World, now I know that Jane isn't you. Jane is an avatar, your protagonist. But I'm curious about a couple things. If Apple Plus was going to make a live action Jane's World, and you're casting the actress, would they have a Southern accent?
I have no idea. That's a good question.
Because now I always hear you.
It would be kind of funny if they did, though. Yeah. I don't know who that would be.
How I mean, Jane is the avatar. Did you model them on anyone? Other characters, other personalities? I mean, did you draw upon different pop cultural references? Like, how did you put Jane together?
Well, I always feel like and it's funny, Schultz did this too a little bit. If you model your characters after someone real, then it's easier to make them feel like they occupy space, that they are a three-dimensional character, that they have a backstory, that what their backstory is. I loosely based characters in the comic on friends of mine. Like Dory, for example, was one of my close friends that I worked in the newsroom with in Atlanta, who was always sort of my reality check. And in the comic, she is Jane's reality check. It's not specifically Dory, but definitely there are some personality traits that I borrowed. And then Ethan, who is Jane's sort of closest friend and roommate, is modeled after my boyfriend from high school, who I'm still friends with, who his knack was all through college. He would always have these big crushes on these women who would end up being lesbians. And I'm like, So it's like that is also a running joke in Jane's world that, his idea of the perfect woman always ends up being a lesbian, like he can't figure it out. And then, of course, his best friend's a lesbian. Anyway, there's a lot of good humor in that. Some of that is based in reality. And there are certain things that you just borrow from real life.
It brings me to a point that Shannon Waters, the editor of Lumberjanes, said in talking about your work, about this idea of the importance of found family. And it seems to be it's one of the was kind of a quintessential experience. It might have been more common maybe for Gen X than I see in my students having today's. A lot of students live at home more, and it's a little more difficult. But this idea that you leave, especially for artists, going to art school, finding your people, and I would think, doubly important as a young queer person to find your family, out in the world. And so I'm wondering, as you look back at this incredible archive that goes back almost 30 years, how, even if Jane isn't you, that you see and recognize your early life, either maybe even through the way you draw the strip, but the concerns that the characters have, the choice of storylines and so on, that like this comic gives you access to this incredible period in your life.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I do say Jane isn't me, but she definitely sources some of her material from my life. Like when she goes to, because this was early 90s, or maybe late 90s by the time the storyline came out, but she has to go visit her mother visits her. I can't remember what the scenario was, and then she makes her roommate Ethan pretend to be her boyfriend, which is just a debacle, like things you did when you just weren't out.
Yeah.
Some of that's definitely sourced from my own experiences. It's funny to look back on a comic that was done that long ago, and you realize um how far the LGBTQ community has come now, right? And it's almost painful to read some of those stories and go, "Oh my God, we were living that in the 80s and 90s."
That's
So
what I think is so interesting about it as an archive, because when you go through Jane's World, you see these, I mean, some of them are just like kind of very kind of, small stories. An ex-girlfriend comes to visit, and she's, gone through a new transformation, little office politic kind of things as well, that capture elements and spirits of the spirit of the time. But then you throw in all these pop culture tropes, abduction by aliens, there's all these fun flights of fancy that happen, including one time when Jane and Shell, her arch nemesis, wash up on an island full of Amazons. And it was just my own little flight of fancy, but I imagined that this was maybe some way an allegory, where you're processing, like, yeah, getting to the big city and going to your first lesbian bars for the first time or something like that. Like, again, finding your community. But maybe I'm embellishing a little too much or reaching.
yeah, who knows? It probably was just the funny thing is, you intuitively, if you're I used to be aware that I would really sit for a long time when I was working. It would take a while to turn off the filters in your head, right? So maybe those kind of stories are what happens when you're finally able to turn off those filters, and you're sort of there is probably a deeper story behind that, but you're using this location and these devices to sort of tell that experience or share that experience while having a little bit of distance from it, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. It's plausible for sure. That's what's happening.
It's
Finally
it's a
getting to
fan
San
theory I'm
Francisco.
pushing.
Yeah, finally getting to San Francisco, feeling this like ultimate freedom to like just be completely who you are. That is sort of the great thing about the San Francisco comics community. And there used to be this awesome show called the Alternative Press Expo. I met so many great cartoonists there who helped me sort of improve my craft and my storytelling, and just, I don't know, just there's a great support system here for cartoonists. So
So you were in full swing. I mean, you had the comic was online, but you were also publishing it as floppies and as trade paperbacks and so on. You were appearing on panels and talking and promoting your work in the late 90s. And that's when you you crossed paths, I guess, for a second time with Schultz, and he offered you the job at his studio.
Yeah, it just sort of happened out of the blue. I was on a panel in Texas. I think we were in San Antonio with Hillary Price and Jan Elliott, and I think there was one other person on the panel, but I can't remember who it was. And it was supposed to be a panel at the National Cartoonist Society, which at the time had probably 500 members, and about 6 of them were women. I mean, it was like this real, like, it just was the nature of newspaper comics, and that's mostly who was in that organization back in the early and mid 90s, and even in the 80s. So anyway, this panel was about why there aren't more women in comics, which happily and gladly now is not the case. I mean, I don't think we're not in the same landscape at all that we were back then. But Schultz and his wife were sitting on the second row, I think, during when the panel was happening. It's a big auditorium, and people are asking a bunch of questions. And I forgot that I was supposed to be on this panel. I was actually out in the hall talking to somebody when my friend Hillary said, "Hey man, aren't you on this panel?" And I'm like, "Oh yeah, shit, I am on this panel." And so we go in there, and I don't even remember what I said, but I was on some real high horse about like people finding their voice and not being distracted by, whether you're going to make money on it or not. And, not following the dollars, but doing work that matters. And like, I was just, I don't know what my deal was. I was really wound up. Anyway, Schultz was sitting in the audience, and then after the panel, I was kind of coming down off the platform, and he's like, do you want to come work at my studio? And I was like, yeah. And he's like, I don't even really know what the job would be. And I was like, I actually don't care. I would have like mowed the grass, frankly. But yeah, that's kind of how it started. It was he was later in his career, and he wanted, I think, to sort of ease toward retirement maybe, but he never said the word retirement for me. But what he wanted to do was really focus on his comic strip, and he wanted another cartoonist / artist to take care of the licensing stuff, like all the other stuff that's based on his comic, but not the comic strip. That's kind of what he was wanting help with. So that's how it all started.
But when you started there, you were working on children's books. You're drawing the characters. Schultz is teaching you how to draw his characters. I think that's a dream of like every kid who falls in love with comics. You got to give us some anecdote about learning directly from the hand of Schultz.
I remember, that was what the first task he wanted was. He wanted to re-release storybooks based on the classic animated specials. There had not been books done in a long time. I mean, I look back at those books now, like 25 years ago, I did those, and I wish I could redo them now because I know a lot more about the characters. And I was just learning when I did those, and they're okay, but I feel like they could be so much better now. At any rate, there were things that I have a memory of, when you look at animation art or some comics where the characters are drawn by more than one person, and the hands are very uniform, like the fingers are very uniform. And I remember I was trying to draw Snoopy holding a sandwich, and he came in and he was like standing next to me. I drawing table. He goes, no, 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 no. He's like, all the fingers need to be different. Like every finger on your hand is unique, right? And if you look at the Peanuts characters, all their fingers are unique, and it gives them this handcrafted liveliness, right? That it's such a small detail, but it makes a big difference.
It seems like that's such a quintessential and traditional cartoonist like rite of passage, like drawing somebody else's character and somebody else's story. But I'm trying to imagine how intimidating it would be having Schultz look over your shoulder while you draw Snoopy.
Yeah, you're never gonna be good. It's just
no, that I don't believe for a second. But that's where you started, and then you did all kinds of things, doing graphic design and layout on everything from products like apparel or video games. But over 25 years, it sounds like you've done just about everything in the studio, and now you're negotiating with NASA on projects, with Apple Plus and all of these incredible companies that do all the merchandising and so on. So you're really overseeing the creative, the legacy. And it just reminds me of this quick anecdote. I was listening to the radio, and an executor from Maurice Sendak, the beloved children's author who did Where the Wild Things Are, many others, he's passed away for many years, or several years now, and but a new children's book just came out, and they were interviewing the executor, and they said, "So how is it you're putting out this book? Did Maurice Sendak leave you instruction for what to do?" And they said, yes, he left us a note, and the note said, "You'll know what to do." So I'm curious, how do you know what to do as Chief Creative Officer? Did he leave instruction, or what is the process by which you decide how these characters continue to live their lives?
No, I didn't get instructions, unfortunately. I do want to say too that, like, just rewinding a minute, so there is a licensing office in New York that we work with hand in hand. It's called Peanuts Worldwide, and they have a creative team. And for the past 20 years, a creative director named Chris Bracco. That team does a lot of the design work that licensees use. And then what happens here at the studios, we're in charge of the legacy. We're in charge of story, I always say, and character. So like our mandate, which is a mission statement that I came up with along with the Schultz family, like you have to have a roadmap, right? To your point, like we didn't have instructions. So what is going to be our guiding principle? And for us, it's that the characters that we protect them so that they never get turned into like icons or logos or spokespeople, like that they always remain rooted in their stories, that you always know who Linus is. You always know who Peppermint Patty is. You know what I mean? That they don't cease to be connected to their stories. And then our sort of Bible is the 50 years of comic strips that Schultz did, because almost every answer you would need or every question you have the answer can be found in that 50 years of material. And if you can't find the exact answer to your question, you can get pretty darn close so that then you can make a judgment call. But at the end of the day, I try to think, what would I want somebody to do with my own work? Right. I would never want it to feel like somebody was selling it out. I would never want to feel like somebody was cheapening the storylines. So we really pay a lot of attention to story here. And so like when we work with anyone like NASA or Apple TV Plus, we're partnering with them to maintain Peanuts as Peanuts, but still tell new stories, right? So you're sort of walking this line between those two things. We've been really lucky that we have really great partners, and the reason they like Peanuts is because it's Peanuts, right? So they don't want to change Peanuts. So it's just a matter of collaborating and telling new stories, but keeping it sort of true to its origins. Yeah, that's a really long-winded answer. I don't even know what the jumping off place was. Sorry about that.
No, I can only imagine like how much goes into navigating the intentions of the artist, going forward. You've said in other places that he wasn't one for small talk. He had a lot of, if you had a conversation, it tended to gravitate to more the philosophical or even the theological. And I mean, obviously these are private conversations, but it's just interesting to me that based on some of the things that came out in the wonderful documentary, Who Are You, Charlie Brown, where we learn a lot about Charles Schultz's background. He actually came from a pretty religious background, as did you, and that but as you went through your lives for different reasons, your theological views kind of evolved over time, you know, for different reasons. So I'm just wondering, is there anything anything you can share about what you learned about his theology, his kind of larger worldview?
It's funny because I've been reading this book about this guy who rediscovers his faith, and I was reminded of this quote that's in it. Living life means experiencing change, and if you have the same faith at 40 that you had as a child, then you haven't really lived, or you've ignored the realities of life. And I think that's what I feel like Schultz and I shared that experience, because he and I were both in sort of an evangelical faith experience as younger people. And then over time, it's not like we walked away from faith, but you start to overlay your own experiences and life experiences. And I think your faith matures. That's what I would say about Schultz. But yeah, he loved to talk about the Old Testament. He loved to talk about Bible verses. You know, he loved to ask you, you know, what things meant, you know. Who knows? I mean, I didn't never know all the answers of stuff, but it was really fun to talk to him about that stuff.
Did you ever have any like theological disagreements where it's like, I don't like that Old Testament story because of this, or like?
No, he wasn't the sort of person that I don't think I would have ever argued with him. I've wondered that if I had worked with him longer, would we have had arguments? But he was so observational in the comments he would make. You didn't feel like it was that he was making a judgment. You more felt like he really honestly wanted to know what you thought, and he was interested in like hearing these other perspectives. So, yeah, luckily we never got into arguments. Who knows, you know, because I didn't get to work with him as long as I would have liked. There were like a million questions I wish I could have asked him. But when I started working here, he already had cancer but didn't know it. So it happened pretty quickly that he was not well. So that was kind of unfortunate. I'm sure I would have learned even more than how to draw hands had, I had more time with him.
Yeah, yes. Well, and wow, I wish I could have been a fly on the wall to listen in on what it's just so interesting to me, as an outside observer, how one navigates. This is maybe a bit too much of a digression, but like issues of faith seem to come up in the specials quite a bit, and that documentary, Who Are You, Charlie Brown? Of course, there's this beautiful soliloquy where Linus rhapsodically philosophizes about the immensity of the universe. And there's actually a moment where I could be mistaken, but I think it's the pillars of creation. There's this beautiful image, which I think maybe the Hubble Space Telescope took it, but originally in the 90s, maybe when Schultz was alive, but it's become far more famous now that the James Webb Space Telescope, it was right around that time. So I don't know if it was actually the James Webb image that was used or not, but it really made me think about the kind of pressures on this legacy. I tend to associate the specials with childhood, but in that moment, I felt like the Peanuts characters are like living the present moment with me, because we're all looking in rapture at these, amazing images. So, with that, I wanted to ask you about Welcome Home, Franklin, one of the most recent specials that came out, when you're talking about all of these negotiations about being true to the spirit of the artist's vision and so on. Franklin is this, groundbreaking Black character from 1969, and but there's a lot of interest in this special because it's kind of the first time he's received like a kind of full treatment or kind of proper treatment, that there was some criticism that his story wasn't kind of fully developed. So can can you talk to us a little bit about what that negotiation was like in terms of building out that story and how it would look?
Well, it's interesting to talk about the animation versus the comic strip, right? For many, many, many years, Bill Melendez, Lee Mendelsohn, and Schultz were the three who did all these sort of classic specials, right? And then Bill and Lee continued that and did a bunch of there's like a huge library of animated shows. And so then you're like, okay, well, we want to tell some new stories, and what do we want? What stories do we want to tell? So there've been a few in that same series, those new specials from Apple TV Plus. There was a Mother's Day special, which was really a look at Peppermint Patty and the fact that she doesn't have a mom. And so what is Mother's Day for a kid who has a dad instead of a mom, right? So, and it sort of leans into her friendship with Marcy. But so somebody might watch that special and go, wow, that's a really modern take on Peanuts. But actually all that material is rooted in the strip. So it's just sort of a retelling of some of those themes in animation. And the same with, there's a Marcy special that came out right before Franklin, and it's a celebration of introverts, and it's about Marcy. So we have been sort of exploring with Apple TV Plus, telling some stories from some of the like secondary cast members that I think are real fan favorites, but who don't really get their moment in the spotlight as much. So the Marcy show is one of those, and then Franklin is like the next show in that lineup. And Franklin is a character, as you said. I think he showed up in 1968 because of a letter that Harriet Glickman wrote to Schultz saying, you have this huge platform where you could really say something. And in the 60s, like you should introduce an African-American character to your cast, because like, look at the platform you had. Look how many people read Peanuts. It would be this huge thing. And he was like, well, he was a guy he was like writing what he knew, right? He's like, I don't know anything about that experience. I don't want to do that in a way that's going to feel trite or oversimplified or whatever, right? Or not feel like authentic. I mean, because that's Peanuts' staying power, is the authenticity that those characters have in those stories, right? You hear their fears, their insecurities, their unrequited wants, right? Just like real people. Anyway, so Franklin shows up in the strip, but he doesn't get as much development in the comic strip as, say, Charlie Brown or Linus or some of the other core cast. So the writing team wanted to highlight Franklin's story. Like, what is his backstory? Where did he come from? And they did source a lot of things from the comic strip. The fact that his dad was in the military, that he moved around, that he was sort of new to the neighborhood, and he was like, who are all these weird kids that have all these, like, who is the Great Pumpkin? Like, all that kind of stuff is all from the comic strip. But sorry, I guess I don't know where this question was going, and I've kind of rambled, but I was just kind of giving the origin story of this special and wanting to tell more of Franklin's story.
Yeah. Well, and that's exactly the kind of again, that there's so many considerations that go into it, because in keeping the spirit of Schultz's vision, there's also a kind of delicate balancing act in these specials in terms of like how you keep the I guess in film it's called mise en scène. How do you keep it feeling like a Peanuts special? Like if Lucy whips out her iPhone and decides to text Schroeder, suddenly we're not in the Peanuts universe anymore. There are guardrails. We have a new story, a new opportunity. I mean, some people talked about kind of, correcting, not correcting is maybe the wrong word. And you're right, there's a big difference between the strip and the cartoons. But that, so maybe some poor choices were made in the cartoons over the years, and there was a desire to kind of correct some of the ways in which Franklin was perceived in some of the cartoons. But there are these other guardrails, like what you can and can't, do to kind of preserve the feel of Schultz's vision as well. So that's not even a question. That's I guess now I'm rambling. Okay. But it brings me maybe to one last question in terms of, you know, there's something like 17,000 strips. I think you said at one point, it is kind of like a Bible that you go to, and you are kind of interpreting the, you know, that text to keep the spirit. And I think about the limits of the intention of the artist, right? I mean, the artist puts their life into it, but a great work of art takes on a life of its own. It lives in the audience in a way, and that audience changes over time. I think of how many like you know, Woodstocks are bouncing around on backpacks, you know, all over the world right now. All of the books, all of the cartoons, and um, you know, that at a certain point, we hit kind of the limitations of what the author intended. You know, there are people who feel deep connection to these characters, and so I mean, you mentioned Peppermint Patty, and there are people who you know, feel very passionately that they know and they identify, you know, that Peppermint Patty is a little different than the other girls, and you know, I know you're well aware there are all kinds of raging online debates, and I'm completely agnostic on the topic of whether or not, you know, what Peppermint Patty's sexuality is, but if nothing else, we could say, you know, looking at her from a contemporary perspective, that in some way, key ways, she's gender non-conforming, right? She doesn't wear a dress like the other girls. And Marcy does this incredibly cute thing where she calls her sir, which is something a goofy thing a kid would do, but it also confuses the idea of her gender a little bit. And even when she's kind of hitting on Chuck, I always kind of felt like she was kind of talking herself into it at the same time or something like that. So I'm just curious. I mean, I know as a CEO, essentially, you know, there's a kind of political dimension to your role as well. So I'm not trying to put you on the spot, but I'm curious, how do you, you know, having known Schultz, you know, how do you confront when you come across a fan who's very passionate about, you know, representation in comics, and you know, their belief that, you know, maybe Schultz was doing something he couldn't explicitly have a gay character in '68 or whatever, that would have been unthinkable, but that there's a kind of coding here for readers to pick up on.
Yeah, it's funny. A conversation I did have with him, because I was like, okay, Schultz's strength is character development, right? His characters, that's Peanuts is a character driven comic, right? It's not a plot driven comic. It's like everything, you can take those characters, put them in any scenario, right? So when I first started working here, I was like, oh man, I'm going to crack this code. I'm going to find out, how did he create these characters? Like, what is the secret, right? Like you're asking, are they based in real life? Are they based on people he knows? We were after lunch one day, we were walking back to the studio, and I said, so why does Marcy call Peppermint Patty sir? And he's like, I have no idea. She's very strange. And I mean, I'm like, okay, that's my answer, right? He's sort of intuitively doing these things. And yes, Peppermint Patty, as a kid who read comics in the 70s, she was awesome. She was like the tomboy, like, you know, poster girl, right? And like it made it okay for the rest of us, who might not be like totally on one side of that gender fence or the other, right? And he was very close friends with Billie Jean King. And some people have said maybe that influenced some of, you know, Marcy and Peppermint Patty. He was also, I think he might have been the only man on the board of the Women's Sports Foundation at the time. So he was very fair-minded about female athletes. He was very supportive of women in all kind of professions. He was a very fair-minded person. But in terms of, did he intentionally try to create a gay character, I would probably say no. It just was the way it turned out, you know, and now we're looking at that character through a modern lens, and we're saying, oh my God, she feels so modern and contemporary, right? And he wasn't even aware of that. He was just writing this character who seemed authentic to him, who now resonates with this modern audience. I mean, I think that's, as you said, the magic of a great work of art, is that it continues to be relevant to audiences over decades, right? like his characters have seriously lived on without him in a way that's just sort of hard to believe. I should go back and just say for a minute that, all these specials that I mentioned, the writing team is actually Schultz family members. It's Craig Schultz, Minister Schultz's son, Charles Schultz's son, and then his son, Brian Schultz, and their writing partner, Cornelius. And for the Franklin special, there was one more writer involved, and that was Rob Armstrong, who is an African-American cartoonist who does a comic called Jumpstart. And Franklin's name is Armstrong because of Rob Armstrong. He and Schultz were friends. So I don't know. That's just a little circling back to, I forget to say things when we're in the moment, but
No,
I
that's
just want to give all of them a shout out.
Well, I want to bring it back to the arc of your career then, and in 2019, I think you gave a keynote address at the Queers in Comics conference in New York in 2019. I tried to find YouTube documentation of that. I've come up empty. So if you've got that recorded somewhere, I'd love to see it. But I want to just hear you talk a little bit. When you look out at the terrain of comics today, and you look at the diversity of voices, you've already mentioned, there's very little comparison between when you were working in the 90s to now. I mean, where do you start? Our beloved Tilly Walden,
Right.
Emily Carroll, I put together my list here, Mariko Tamaki, Tommy Parrish, Trung Le Nguyen, not to mention like Heartstopper, which at my local comic shop, they can't keep it on the shelf. Like it's just, it flies off. So on one, we have this, clearly compared to any time previously, the greatest diversity of voices, but we're also living in a time of increasing legislation and book bans. We have Maya Kolbabe, Genderqueer is now the most banned book, 3 years running. We also find ourselves at the forefront of so many culture wars. So, from the breadth of your experience, I'm just, what do you see? What really jumps out at you when you look at the landscape of comics today?
That's an impossible question to answer.
This is why I'm not a professional interviewer. It's
No, I'm just like, I was like, oh my God, that's like a dissertation in itself. I was gonna say the reason you can't find that presentation on YouTube is because in it, I had a slide. It was a photo of meeting Miyazaki in Japan. And we took a photo, but he asked that it never be online. Like I never share that photo online. So then they couldn't figure out how, I think they couldn't figure out how to extract that slide from the interview or the talk. So they just they didn't upload any of it. Yeah, that's okay. Who knows what I said? It could have been dumb anyway. So maybe I'm better off it's not out there.
Stop.
But I think the one thing I will say, because I'm like, I know Maya, I know a lot of the folks or some of the folks that you mentioned. And I would say that as a creator, I'm sort of glad I'm not doing Jane's World now and have transitioned to kids graphic novels, because I think not that my generation doesn't have things to say about it, but I think the language and how we talk about gender and how we talk about experiences, it changes and evolves so quickly. I don't know. I don't trust myself. I don't know if I could keep up with it if I were doing Jane's World. Like I will sometimes go back and read back issues of Jane's World, and I was like, and it's almost like there are cringeworthy moments in there where I'm like, oh man, I can't believe like we were saying that stuff. I can't believe we were living that stuff. And anyway, I really, really appreciate all the younger up and coming cartoonists who are tackling these stories and writing in this time. And I just appreciate their perspectives, and I learn a lot from them,
Well, and I guess we're getting close to the time, but that brings us, there's more to unpack there, definitely. But I have to ask you about peanut butter and crackers. And and I'll repeat it, your Beverly Cleary Children's Choice Award winning peanut butter and crackers. And you've now got three books in the series, or you've got you have got a new one coming out. Is that right?
Yeah, the fourth one I just sent the
Fourth.
pencils. It's the fourth and the fifth volumes are going to only be out in the UK, I think, with Nosy Crow.
Right.
But yeah, I just sent the pencils for the fourth book. But so I think, I don't know if you have this experience because we're close to the same age, but I find that I just want to draw with all the shit storm of life and everything that's going on politically and, as you said, in legislation, all that kind of stuff. I sort of just want to live in this world of, three happy animals who are kind to each other and their focus is on snacks and cozy places to get under a blanket and friends at the dog park. I mean, sort of, there's something really nice about writing these stories that are for readers who are just starting out in life and figuring out who they are and who their friends are and how to make friends and, what makes them happy. And I don't know, those really like, just the entry point, right? I don't know how to describe it, but I find that I actually buy a lot of kids' comics because they're so charming. There's so many good, talented cartoonists doing young reader graphic novels now, and I really enjoy them. Just the quality of artwork and storytelling. Um, I, of course, can't think of anything right off the top of my head, but um,
Well, and you beat me to my question, which is, why at this point, in your career you wanted to focus. But I'm wondering now also if it's like, does it give you an opportunity to kind of implement some of those things you learned from Schultz and from working on Peanuts? I mean, that's part of the, again, the magic of the strip. It's kind of suspended in this kind of eternal kind of childhood, and that what that frees you up to do as a cartoonist is that at least I guess that's what I think I'm hearing, the kind of the freedom that
absolutely, absolutely, yeah, yeah. But I couldn't draw a kid strip, right? Because then it would be like I'm just channeling Schultz. But definitely having worked in under this sort of, umbrella in this like universe for so long, you do start to pick up some of the like design and storytelling and that is a thing too with Schultz is like as part of our mission statement, like you don't want the characters to be too you don't want to be the characters to be used in a way that they're too self-aware or they cease to have this sort of Peanuts characters are simultaneously wise and innocent, right? They're like wise 8-year-olds, and you want to maintain that sort of storytelling. Um, so my, peanut butter crackers, it's two dogs and a cat, and the humans don't talk, which I'm sure is subconsciously inspired by Peanuts, right? And the adults don't talk. So it's all focused on their world and their experience. So it keeps their world really sort of contained.
it's a beautiful series of books. And so when is the fourth one coming out again?
I should know that, but I think holiday this year, but I could be wrong.
And do you have any other, projects, hypothetical or otherwise, that are, on your, eventual to-do list that we might someday be able to look forward to?
Well, I've been drawing this bear forever, and I think at some point that bear is going to have a story, but I just don't know what it is yet. I was actually talking with a writer friend of mine about trying to help me figure it out. Like maybe it's a story that I should draw and someone else should write, but I don't know if other artists work this way. But if I have a character that keeps showing up in the margins of every sketchbook and or just sketching it all the time, I'm like, okay, this character for some reason is rising to the surface and it's going to have a life of its own. I just don't know what it is yet. I mean, that's sort of how all my books have developed. Stinky Cecil was about a bunch of, amphibians and one free range hamster that kind of came out of sketchbooks. And then, peanut butter and crackers is the same way. So I think the bear might be next. It's either a bear or a rabbit. I'm not sure, but
I
Because
know
there's a
it's,
rabbit that keeps showing up too.
and I think they've shown up on your Instagram a few
Yeah,
times.
yeah.
Do you find that's a good way to kind of work through ideas, posting?
Yeah, it is for me. Yeah.
Okay. Well, Paige, I can't tell you again what a pleasure it's been to just hang out and hash through some of these things. And I really can't encourage people enough. Oh, I do want to put one last plug. And what I failed to say is how the collected or selected works of Jane's World came out in 2019. It was a Lambda Literary Award finalist, and it really is a beautiful book for anyone who is really keen to check out Jane's World. That is where I recommend beginning. But it's also still running on Go Comics. It's still being updated every week.
Yeah, they're rerunning the whole series, but
Yeah.
thank you for mentioning the book. That is kind of like the greatest hits of Jane's World. So there was no way to collect all 20 years, but that's sort of the favorite storylines.
Oh, and can I just ask, within Jane's World, is there a storyline when you're thinking back on the collection that, you know, stands out for you? A particular story that you particularly were, you know, happy with, or that you like to return to?
That's a tough one. It's funny, sort of all of volume 2 are the comics I go back to, which would be, if you're looking at the floppies, it would be issue 7 through 12. And I think it's because the first 6 issues, I was trying to just sort of figure it all out. And by the time that Shell was introduced as Jane's nemesis, I felt like the storylines really gelled. I think that's my favorite era. But some of the later stuff is funny too. There's a really funny, I think, a funny storyline where I think I might have mentioned this to you, but Jane has to sell her car to pay her rent, and her friend Ethan gives her a bike to ride to work, and she wrecks her bike and loses her glasses, and then a squirrel steals her glasses, and then a bird. And the glasses go on this path, and they have a life of their own, and they eventually come back to her. But in the meantime, Jane has these round glasses that are her identifier, right? That's like who she is, and she has to figure out who she is without that. And so it's just like a funny, just character exploration. Anyway, it's a very silly storyline, and the glasses end up coming back to her via a crab in a fish tank at a seafood restaurant. So that's because anything can happen in Jane's World. That's my motto.
Yeah, I love that. I love that strip. I love how that one is drawn. Again, it's beautiful in terms of its storytelling and choice of moment. It's a beautiful piece. So Jane, Jane, I did it. I was wondering, would I get through this without doing that? What an
That's
incredible
okay.
slip. Paige, thank you so much. It's been such a pleasure.
Thank you, Christian. You're amazing to talk to. Thank you so much.
So this conversation unlocked a lot of great childhood memories, reading Peanuts comic strips and watching the Charlie Brown series specials on TV during long weekends off from school. So Paige Braddock and Christian Giroux, thank you so much for this brilliant In Conversation segment, and for joining us this TCAF. It's such an honor. And for those of you watching, check this awesome program on YouTube, on the TorontoComics channel, and our other amazing programs, digital and IRL, during the weekend. And on behalf of the TCAF team, thank you so much and have a great festival weekend.
Thank you.